Oh, can I invite us back to our seats, please? Just about to start. Halfway there, we've got a lot to cover this afternoon. So take your positions. Take your positions. Okay. While we wait for the others to join us, I'm going to introduce Danny to us. If you're just joining us this afternoon's session, it's a real pleasure having Danny with us to share with us and to bless us. Danny leads the Evangelical Alliance's advocacy work across the UK. He first joined the Evangelical Alliance in 2008, and he's had a wide variety of roles, including working on policy advocacy and media relations. And he oversees the EA's public policy work and engagement with parliament and assemblies in the respective governments of the UK, as you can tell from what he shared earlier. And yeah, he is very passionate about encouraging Christians to live out their faith with all areas of their life publicly. And he also comments on political issues, both in the Evangelical Alliance's publications and to the press. So it's my pleasure to welcome Danny. And let's stretch our hands to him and just pray for him while he takes us through this afternoon session. So, yeah, Father, we thank you for Danny. Thank you for his life. Thank you for all that he's brought to us already in the Q&A session. Lord, we open our hearts to what you've put in there for him to share with us, to serve us this evening. We pray, Lord, that it will be interesting, relevant, and motivating to us for the times we live in. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm doing a little bit of shuffling of what I'm going to say because I've already covered a few things that I was planning on covering in some of the questions, and also reflecting on some of what Brian's covered this morning. We did talk earlier in the week, so I'm going to be juggling a little bit in terms of what I'm saying. So if I start jumping around, I apologise for that. Thank you for the introduction. As Tony said, I work on policy and government relations and really anything that's to do with Christianity in public life. It's what I'm passionate about and it's what I'm engaged in. So many of the issues that we've been talking about today are things that I'm involved in on a day-to-day basis. But our passion and desire is that we see Christians equipped to engage themselves. So I work with some great people, and it's good to work and seek to represent evangelical Christians in the parliaments across the UK. I'm up in Scotland on Wednesday and Thursday this coming week, talking to members of the Scottish Parliament around some legislation that's coming up there. But really, we do want to equip people to live for Jesus all across the UK in every context they're in. What I'm going to be doing this afternoon, I'm going to roughly split it into two. I want to talk, first of all, primarily around some of what the law says around sharing the gospel. I'm going to do slightly less of that because of a lot of what Brian's already covered, particularly in relation to some of the criminal aspects there. But then I'm going to look particularly at the workplace and what you can do in the workplace, what you can't do, what the challenges are, and some of the tricky issues that crop up. So most of what I'm saying comes from two different publications. The first of all is called Speak Up. We first produced this in 2017 with the Lawyers Christian Fellowship. It's a guide to what the law says about sharing your faith. We have distributed over 100,000 copies of this. And the primary answer is the law gives us great freedom to talk about our faith. It really does. And I think I want to temper some of the challenges that are very real with an encouragement that we do have great freedoms and we live in a country that prizes our freedom. And I think that's something we want to stand behind and support and seek to live out. Because I think actually if we give up on those freedoms, they're more likely to be eroded. And then the second thing is something we produced last year called Living for Jesus at Work. There are copies of this at the back. Speak Up's very simple, it's just one publication. Living for Jesus at Work is more complicated because there's 3. There's the main resource that says a collection of advice, wisdom and guidance. It is mostly wisdom and guidance because, as we've already said, how the law interacts in the workplace is quite complex and it's not easily boiled down to generic guidance. But then we also have 2 shorter publications. One is a Bible study guide, which would be ideal for Christian fellowships or groups in workplaces to look through. And then also a little pocket book, which we created just to help you reflect through Monday to Sunday, how are you living out your faith in the workplace. So for the next hour-ish, probably slightly less than an hour, I'm going to talk about Speak Up, and then we'll have probably quite a short break, hopefully. I just don't want to go all the way through till 5 without a break. And then I'm going to talk about the workplace, and then we will have some time at the end for more questions, because I'm conscious I've answered some questions. I'm now going to talk, and that might provoke more questions. And I also don't want you to be totally overwhelmed by input, so there'll be a few gaps and breaks for you to discuss and reflect yourselves on what we're talking about. But I want to start with reflecting on Jesus' words the final time he was with his disciples before he ascended into heaven. He exhorted them to do as he had done and to go into all the world and preach the good news to all creation. So from the start, Christians who began to fulfill this mandate were met with a mixed reaction. Whilst some people who heard what the disciples had to say were cut to the heart by the message of Jesus and followed Jesus, others were greatly disturbed. You read about that in Acts. And they sought to censor or to silence those who wanted to spread the good news. And we know that little has changed in the many years since. The contexts have changed. Sometimes it's been easier and sometimes it's been harder. But we continue to live in a world where those who proclaim the good news of salvation are sometimes welcomed and sometimes met with hostility. And we know that however uncertain we might be about the reception that the words we have to say, what the reception will be, the Christian message must be proclaimed to all people. And that is a responsibility we have. And that is the way that they will be reconciled to the living God. And it can seem that we live in a society where it is increasingly difficult. We've reflected on some of this already. And I in no way want to undermine or deny that. And I think the pressure often comes from non-legal sources. And I'll say a bit more about this later, that most of the pressure often comes from cultural pressures, from sometimes the rules and regulations in any given setting, or just activity that, I think in the case of what was mentioned by the lady at the back, probably activity that I suspect would be ruled out of order I don't know what your formal context was there, but even if you're a volunteer, you do have employment rights as a volunteer as well. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not offering legal advice. We do see atheistic or humanistic organizations with a disproportionate voice. And I think that's something else to remember. The organisations, while there are a lot of people in the UK who don't have a faith, actually a lot of them are more open to faith than we might think. The organisations that represent the humanists or the atheists are tiny. They're tiny organisations, but They have a very loud voice often. And we live in this society that on one level prizes a plurality of diversity, but then on the other hand, it seems quite difficult if the diversity we want to engage with doesn't look like the diversity they want. I know someone in the civil service who works in government has come up with this phrase, viewpoint diversity, which I find really helpful. That what does our diversity structures and systems extend far enough to include a diversity of beliefs and viewpoints? Or is it really just very surface level? It's what people look like, their race, their age, their sex, whether or not they're disabled. Or are we willing to have a difficult, challenging, diverse context where we do have people who disagree and we find a way to live with that? So, do our laws inhibit the freedom that we have to talk about Jesus, or do they promote that freedom? On balance, I think our legal system provides for us to have freedom to share the gospel. Like, on balance, I think the protection of rights to speak about our religion, to hold our religious beliefs, enable us to do that. Some of the stuff that I will get to mean that it's often more complicated than that. Where we're speaking can make a difference. How we're speaking, who we're speaking to, all of these things make a difference. But our freedom to speak the gospel and for freedom and the freedom of people to respond to that gospel is protected. And I think that's what I want to work for. I want to work for a situation where the gospel is proclaimed as much as possible and where people have the opportunity and the freedom to respond to that. Some people won't respond positively. Some people will reject it. Some people may respond with hostility. But I want people to have the freedom to do that. I think one of the challenges we do face in our culture is religious illiteracy. And again, we've touched on some of this already, this idea that you can have a faith and it not affect what you believe or what you do. I think as an evangelical Christian, my faith hugely influences what I do, and I'll say a bit more. I'll say a bit more about the Evangelical Alliance a little bit later, but activism is one of the core hallmarks of evangelical Christianity. It makes a difference. It pushes us into action. So the idea that we can have beliefs and we can have views, but not want to do anything about it, just doesn't add up. And I think that illiteracy is very common. So, to some legal things. We've talked about the Human Rights Act and the protection that is there in that. That there is this, you have the UN, you have the European Convention of Human Rights, and you have the Human Rights Act. Brian mentioned this morning that much of that came out of the Second World War. And actually, it was largely a lot of the people involved in drafting it were Christians. It was signed in the Methodist Central Hall in Westminster. It's a different talk, but human rights very much have Christian foundations. And I think for all of some of the challenges around how human rights legislation are applied, I think there's something as Christians we should seek to defend and protect. And remember that actually as Christians, it was our fellow brothers and sisters that were often instrumental in developing the frameworks around that. Just maybe one other introductory point. In terms of particularly issues facing street preachers, most of the situations that have arisen in the last, say, 5 years have not led to successful prosecutions. Most of the time, either charges have been dropped or prosecutions have failed, or charges weren't actually ever brought. The police might have been involved, but people weren't charged. It doesn't mean that there aren't problems around the policing of street preaching, but actually, largely, the law has been found to defend the right of Christians to speak about the gospel. My favourite quote when it comes to anything in this area, just find my little note, is from someone, I believe it was Lord Justice Sedley. And he said, free speech includes not only the inoffensive, but the irritating, the contentious, the eccentric, the heretical, the unwelcome, and the provocative, provided it does not tend to provoke violence. Freedom only to speak inoffensively is not worth having. And that's absolutely crucial. And that really, for me, is the test of legislation that. So I'm much more involved in the political, legislative side of what laws are being introduced. And when it comes to questions of freedom of speech, it's important we hold that in mind. And I think that's the standard we want. That actually, as long as it's not provoking and leading to violence, we should seek to protect speech, even if we really don't like what it has to say. I think it means as Christians, sometimes we need to do a better job of protecting the speech of others that we vehemently disagree with. Because actually, I think we need to be grown up and live in a world where we can have really significant disagreements about matters that really matter to us, that really matter, and we do find offensive, but accept that is part of living in a vibrant, plural culture. So, according to some research, we did some research last year with a bunch of other people, Alpha, the Louis Palau Association, Hope Together, and it's called Talking Jesus. If you go on the Evangelical Alliance website and Google Talking Jesus report, which you'll probably find it. I only had one copy of that one. We surveyed 4,000 people around their attitudes towards Christianity. It was the follow-up of a survey that we did in 2015. And we found, in 2015, 1 in 5 non-Christians who, after a conversation with a Christian, said that they wanted to know more about Jesus. So 1 in 5. So if you talk to 5 people about Jesus, one of them's going to want to know more. That's pretty encouraging. In 2022, it's down to 1 in 3. So you talk to 3 people, one of them is likely to want to know more. So there's an appetite and there is an openness to the gospel. Only 53% of non-Christians know a practicing Christian. So 4% say they don't know if they know one, which actually I think is quite an honest answer because I suspect quite a few people don't know. 42% say they don't know one. So there is a real need for us to know more non-Christians and for more non-Christians to know us. We asked people where would they go to find out about the Christian faith. I'm going to do a bit of a quick pop quiz. Where do you think people go to find out about the Christian faith? Google we had. So Google is the number one source. 26% of people would go to Google. I heard church. Going to a local church is actually joint second at 22%. Any other? YouTube. Yep, YouTube clocks in at 10% of people would go to YouTube. Talking to a friend or family member is 15%. There is a course question. Going to a talk or joining a course to find out more at 7%, which is relatively low. 9% would talk to a colleague. Sorry? Complete stranger. No, that wasn't an option. But that's... like 3% of people would pray. 22% of people would read the Bible. So YouTube, searching Google was number 1, and then going to a local church and reading the Bible were the second 2 highest sources where people would go. How do they know us? So of those non-Christians who know a practicing Christian, how do you know that person? The 31% through a family, 35% as friends. Only 11% say they know a practicing Christian through their workplace. So that's a lot of people who work with Christians who don't know that they work with Christians. And the final stat, how do people, that's my next question for you all, how do people come to faith? So the previous question was, how do people find out about, or where do people go to find out? People who come to faith, how does that happen? A conversation with a Christian you knew well would come in like fifth or sixth place at 15% of people. So overwhelmingly, the most important is growing up in a Christian family. So 35% of people who come to faith, that is the primary reason. So it's not exclusive, they could tick more than one. And Sunday school also clocks in at 19%. Reading the Bible, 24%. Attending a church service, other than a wedding or a funeral. 11% responding to the gospel at a Christian event or service. I think my verdict when I looked at that is that actually people come to faith through a variety of different means. So raising children is still the most important thing people can do for helping people come to know Jesus. As a parent of young children, it's a burden you recognise. But actually people come to faith through reading the Bible. They come to faith through just coming into a church building. They come to faith through friends. They come to faith through conversations. And then they come to faith through kind of classical mass evangelism, through events. And I think, for me, it just says that there's a role for it all. Some people are like, oh, is it the age of evangelism or this? Has it changed? I think we need to be doing it all. I think there is a space for the big events. There's a space for focusing on our friendships, on our colleagues, on our families, on the Sundays, how our Sunday services are helping people come to know Jesus. I think we need to do all of that. Oh, I think there's the limitations of research. People could tick, I think they could tick the top three. I always, when I hear a survey result, I always want to ask the next 5 questions of the person, what do they mean by this? What do they mean by that? But you can't always get all of that information. So one of the things that really struck me from both what Brian was saying this morning and our conversation since lunch is the crucial importance of our posture. And for a session all around the law, I'm not going to talk about that law very much. There is some law, I'm going to talk about some law. But I think how we act is crucially important. And that very much came through with what Brian was saying earlier as well. How we engage, how do we act with wisdom? And when we get onto the workplace stuff, that's even more the case. Because while there are some judgments on some interesting things around employment and provision of services, most of it isn't governed by the law. Most of it is around wisdom, it's about guidance, it's about internal policies of organisations. And actually those policies are things that we can usually influence. And that comes back to the point about engaging with the systems. So let me just roll on to what the law does say. I've talked about the human rights framework. I've mentioned also the difference between criminal and civil law. So most of what Brian's concerned about is the criminal law. Where do you break the criminal law? And that relates, in this context, hate crime, public order offences, there's breach of the peace. There's a few other areas where you could fall foul of the criminal law. But most of the things that relate in this area are not criminal. Most of it it's civil law, but it's also bylaws and other complicated things like that. Religion and belief is protected in the law. So the Equality Act protects 9 characteristics. Brian mentioned this earlier. I'm going to open up so I actually quote correctly, because I will forget one. Age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage or civil partnership, but only in cases of employment, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion or belief, sex, and sexual orientation. So what's actually important here in relation to our question around gender is it's sex that is protected. And there's been quite a lot of controversy around this, but really that is around biological sex. So, for example, single-sex spaces, particularly for women, are protected. So an organisation can, with justification, have a space that is only for women and only for women who are biologically female. The classic example is a domestic abuse shelter. That is a legitimate discrimination. So discrimination is not always illegal. That is legal discrimination. They can do that. The other point is that it is gender reassignment that is a protected characteristic. And that gets tricky because a lot of people have not gone through formal gender reassignment, don't have a gender recognition certificate that's been through the process they would identify as a gender other than that which they're born. And the case law on that is uncertain at the moment. It's a point of contest. At what point does the law protect that person? Do they have to be seeking to medically transition, even if they've not completed the process? Or does it protect someone who is identifying regardless of whether or not they're seeking to? That's more a point of interest because it's up in the air at the moment. So religion and belief is protected. That means that in employment, in how goods and services are provided. So I said earlier that you can't restrict the provision of goods and services on the basis of someone's sexuality. Other people can't restrict the provision of goods and services based on religion and belief either. There are exemptions. You don't have to provide services you aren't already providing if you're providing a service to a particular group. So a Christian bookshop doesn't have to be forced to sell every book or books of another faith. So it is a bit more complicated, but religion and belief is a protected characteristic. If I go into a shop and someone doesn't serve me because I'm a Christian, if I went into a shop and asked for a christening cake, for example, and someone said, "No, I'm not serving you, I'm Hindu, and therefore we're not going to serve Christians," that would be discrimination. The law provides that protection. So around employment and around the provision of goods and services, there is quite robust protection around religion and belief. The main issue, and we'll come back to this in terms of the workplace on employment, is what does it mean to manifest your faith? So the Human Rights Act and the Equality Act protect religion and belief, and the articles are in two clauses. The first is universal. So everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Full stop. That right cannot be interfered with. But the freedom to manifest one's religion or beliefs shall be subject only to such limitations as are prescribed by law and are necessary in a democratic society in the interests of public safety, for the protection of public order, health or morals, or for the protection of rights and freedoms of others. This is where it gets complicated, because you can have your freedom, you can have how you manifest your religious belief restricted. Like, to use an extreme example, if I believe in child sacrifice, it is reasonable for the law to restrict my freedom of belief. Like, that's an extreme example, but I'm using it just to show that I can't claim, oh, my religious belief believes in child sacrifice, therefore I can do that. There are limitations on how we manifest. The question then is, where does that so that's an extreme example everyone would agree with. Where do you start to draw the line at what is necessary in a democratic society for the protection of morals and order? And that is a bit subjective. And that is the point that is decided case by case in the courts, and that courts then look at previous judgments to make decisions about. Courts also talk about, and I mentioned this already, so there's the belief, there's the manifestation of that belief, and then there is inappropriate or unreasonable manifestation of that belief. So I'm a Christian, therefore I manifest it in certain ways. And a classic in this context would be, I share my faith with other people. That is a manifestation of your belief. You tell people about Jesus. There are then reasonable and unreasonable ways of doing that. So, for example, in an employment context, it might be reasonable to argue that actually a manifestation of my belief is telling other people about what I believe. And a court may find that actually, if someone asks me a question and I answer it, that's fine. But if I was if I was a teacher, and before I started every lesson, I used my position of authority to give a gospel presentation that everyone had to sit through, and then I got on with teaching maths, that would probably, well, almost certainly be considered an unreasonable manifestation of your belief. So these things are all discretionary, and that's where it gets really tricky. And as we started to do the work last year around living out your faith at work, it's really hard to put in any specificity what the law says, because in most cases it is down to the particulars of where you work, the profession you're in, the guidelines that are in place on that, and that all gets complicated. But let's go back to sharing your faith. In private, if you're in your own home, you can say most things. Like, there is a scale in terms of how things, how the law interferes, and actually, in your home, the law's not going to stop you talking about your faith. I put the caveat on because there's always a caveat necessary, because it's not absolutely universal, and once you start broadcasting over the internet, things get complicated again. So you might be sat in your home and you might think everything's fine, but if you're streaming it, actually suddenly you're not in the privacy of your own home, and a whole load of other legislation comes into play. If you're in public, you actually have quite a lot of freedom, because most of the rights that we've talked about come into play. And there might be questions about amplification, about licenses. I was reminded, I was involved in organising a prayer event in Parliament Square in Westminster, which was wonderful to be a part of, but you had the ridiculous situation. I don't know if you've ever been to Parliament Square in Westminster. The pavement belongs to Westminster City Council, and I'm going to get this wrong and someone's going to correct me, who probably knows more about policing in Westminster than I do. But the square in the middle is under the jurisdiction of the Greater London Authority. So if you're on the pavement, you needed permission from Westminster Council, but if you're on the square in the middle, you needed permission from City Hall, it was Boris Johnson who was the mayor at the time. And City Hall. So you do have, like, there is paperwork to do, and sometimes it's a lot of paperwork and it can be a pain. But that was the case. Like, actually, we could hold a large prayer event in Parliament Square. We had to fill in some paperwork. We had to get permission to do it. And it was classed as a static demonstration because that was how they decided to categorise it. But you do have significant freedom to speak about your faith in public. Again, be sensible about bylaws. If you're doing beach missions, if you're doing events in parks, there are likely to be regulations. But talk to your local authority, talk to the people involved. The area that gets complex is places that you think are public property but are not. And there's more of them than you think. The easiest example is a shopping centre. If you're in a shopping centre, it's not public property. It is almost certainly owned by a private company who can have their own restrictions on what is done in that place. Increasingly, and I know this is the case in London, but I'm sure it's the case in other places, there are pedestrianised areas that you think are public property but are not. So near where the Evangelical Alliance offices are in King's Cross, there's massive redevelopment all around King's Cross. Most of that land is private. Right? So there's a lovely open piazza near where we are, and you think, oh, that's great, I could go and do something. You'd need permission from the King's Cross Corporation or whatever they're called. So all of those situations complicate things, and when it's someone else's private space, they have more discretion. Now, coming back to what I said about the provision of goods and services, they can't discriminate against you because of your religion and belief. So if they would let someone of another faith do something, but they wouldn't let you as a Christian do it, that becomes discriminatory. Where it gets complicated is they say, oh, we don't allow any faith. And they use that as a way of saying no to any faith groups. And they do that. And actually that is just something quite a lot of organisations and venues, you might come across it if you try hiring rooms. They'll say you can use it for all these things, but you can't use it for religious purposes. I don't think that really works, but people do it anyway. I touched on online just now, so you do have Communications Act responsibilities once you are broadcasting something. Churches are having to get a lot more savvy about this when they broadcast sermons. There was a big case a few years ago in Northern Ireland about a pastor who said some frankly offensive things around Islam. But I use that term specifically because the court found that it was not grossly offensive. Because if it was grossly offensive, he would have been guilty under the Communications Act. So if you're broadcasting online, there are other restrictions in place that you need to be aware of. And on top of the law, you have the policies and procedures and regulations of tech companies. So as a really minor example, the Evangelical Alliance have a podcast called Cross Section. If you listen to your podcasts, I would encourage you to listen. There's a group of us that do it, so I'm totally biased because I'm often on it. And we talk about culture and faith and politics and what's in the news. But we tried to running some ads. So it's Mental Health Awareness Week this week. We had an interview with Emma Scrivener, a Christian author, that we'd done the week before. We wanted to promote this podcast episode on Facebook. We ran into a lot of hurdles because we were promoting social issues, and if you're engaged in any political or social issues, there's just a bunch of other hurdles and loops and disclaimers and things. So the rules and policies, actually I just saw a notification this morning that finally our advert had been approved on like the third or the fourth revision of it. So the rules and procedures of the companies do make a difference. So if you're streaming something on Facebook or if you're putting a video on YouTube, they do have quite a lot of discretion, and it is potentially problematic. It's one of the things that I've been concerned about in some of the government's proposals around the online safety bill, about whether that would actually give tech companies too much power or would put tech companies in a place where they were kind of almost preemptively restricting content because they didn't want to get in trouble. So there's been a lot of criticism of particularly Instagram, and there was the Molly, I can't remember her, I think her name was Molly, a teenage girl who died of anorexia, and a lot of Instagram posts around negative body image were considered culpable in that case. And actually how Instagram was promoting posts around that and how posts were being seen. So I want to take very seriously that harmful content does exist, and we do need to find ways to tackle it. The problem was that how the government have been looking at doing it has potentially thrown up a bunch of other hurdles that would restrict freedom of speech and freedom of expressions online. The final thing I'm going to say in this section is around buffer zones. Brian mentioned it this morning, and I thought it was worthy of just a little additional comment because it's in the news quite a lot at the moment. If you don't know, buffer zones are put in place, and they are specifically in this one context, put in place around abortion clinics to prevent people engaging in activity that is considered to be harmful for women who are seeking to access services at the abortion clinic. So currently they're in place in, I think, 4 or 5 local authorities. They're done through local council laws. So Bournemouth, Birmingham, Ealing, I think Glasgow has it in place. I think there's 5. They're slightly varied. But they put a 100 or 150 metre exclusion zone around an abortion clinic, and you can't, the minor differences area to area, but you can't do activity that would be considered to be influencing a woman in terms of or preventing her from accessing those services. And there is currently a bill going through Parliament that would make these zones nationwide. There's some discussion as to exactly how that would be implemented. There have been 2 or 3 cases recently, 2 of which I believe would be correct to say the CPS dropped the charges recently, of a woman who was silently praying in it, and another man, there was a priest, and I can't remember what he was doing. I know he had a bumper sticker on his car. But in both cases, the CPS did drop the prosecutions. I think they dropped it rather than it going to court fully. But the problem is the lack of certainty as to what you can do and what you can't do. And there's multiple issues there. Is what is being done in those zones considered harmful, and is that reasonable? And then actually, when it's relating to private prayer, silent prayer, is that an undue restriction on someone's religion and belief? So there are multiple layers in play around this. My view is that I think a local solution is better because it can deal with particular problems in particular areas, and where if there is a persistent pattern that is causing harm to women, then actually I don't think Christians should be involved in activity that is causing harm, and even if we have very strong views potentially. But I think at the other end of the scale, some of the proposed solutions seem very heavy-handed and potentially would restrict any activity in those areas. So that is a live issue at the moment. In fact, it's back in Parliament on Tuesday this week. Right, let's just take a pause and just take a few minutes to turn to someone in 2s or 3s and think about some of the issues that we've raised. Where is it hard to speak up for Jesus? Where are there challenges around that? Where might we want, and what stops us? What stops us, and what would help us to speak up more? So let's just take just a few minutes.